Nora Speaks is a weekly podcast that tugs at the soul and consciousness of the Black community. With show topics such as youth empowerment, education, women's impact, and civic engagement, Nora Speaks challenges the listener to not only join the movement, but be the movement. On the show, you'll learn from insightful guests who have demonstrated capacity in these fields and more, and I'm your host, Nora Muhammad. Welcome to the show. Welcome to another episode of the Nora Speaks podcast, and I am your sister, Nora Muhammad. It is always a privilege and a pleasure to be with you week after week and sharing information, ideas, and insights that I believe are relevant and necessary to improve the outcomes that we are facing in our community. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. It's something that I'm deeply passionate about, and I was inspired actually to share this with you, the Nora Speaks audience. It's from a conversation that I had with a young sister who I guess we could say I'm mentoring, and the sister is growing and she's learning, and she's always asking really pertinent, intuitive questions. And recently, the sister asked me a question about gentrification, and I thought, wow, she's sharp, she's growing. She really wants to understand, and have a perspective on what's happening. How many young people are really tuned in and plugged into the news and their community and what they can do themselves to improve what's happening in their local communities. And so I will share some of what I shared with her. I'll share that with you now. And just so that we have definition, gentrification is when there is an urban, poor, poverty-stricken, deteriorated neighborhood or a city or a town, and there's reinvestment in this urban area by middle class or affluent people, sometimes corporations, and often this reinvestment comes with a displacing of the lower income, poor people who lived in that community. And it's happening all over the country. It's happened in San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia. It's happening in Detroit, Chicago, and many urban areas. And so just to have a little bit of history, and I'm not going to go too deeply because I really want to get to the point, but just a little bit of history and context in gentrification. There was a time when obviously most blacks lived in the South. We worked as slaves on plantations. And when I say worked, I'm not saying work like we got paychecks and we were employees. We were slaves working the plantations of white slave masters. And then once the slaves were emancipated, and I put that in air quotes, once the slaves were emancipated, they didn't have an education. They didn't have money. They did not have an economic base. They did not own property. They could not go to another territory or another country or go back to where their own people are, from whence their forefathers were taken. So they're free, but where can they go and what can they do? So for many of those emancipated slaves, what they did with no money, no homes, what they would do instead is sharecrop. And what is that? Well, it's slavery by another name, because sharecropping is when someone or a family would rent a little cottage, a little hut, shack is probably more accurate, would rent a shack on a plantation, and to pay their rent or their usage of that shack, they would work in the fields picking cotton or tobacco or working the land, and they would plant crops, they would harvest crops, and they would turn their earnings, their meager earnings, over to whomever owned that land. And so and that's why I say it's really slavery by another name. These people weren't achieving incomes where they could live a American dream, where they can be free of working on somebody else's plantation. Although that did happen in very rare cases, and you can look this up in your own study of history, but to a large extent, our people continued to work on the fields, on these plantations, and the harvested crops that they would produce would be the income that they would use to pay their rent to live on that property, because our people had to live somewhere. And I was listening to an interview that a sister, her name is Angela Lewis, she was having a conversation with her mother about a time in which her mother worked during sharecropping. And she explained that when she worked for the white man's plantation, she barely made, or they, the family, because children also would work sharecropping, right? So the family really only made enough just to get by. And the children would have to participate in the labor and in the work and couldn't attend school because they needed all hands on deck. Well, it happened that they were able to move and find work on a black man's plantation, sharecropping. And this black man did not want these children to miss school. So it was his policy that, yes, you work here, but your children must attend school. And so sharecropping was something that happened throughout the South. And when the Industrial Revolution hit after slavery, factories were opening up in the North. And the cities became industrialized. So a lot of blacks migrated from the South to the North. I'm sure you've heard about this as well. And so black people migrated to these cities. And it wasn't a cakewalk, moving from the South into the North and trying to find a place to live and get work. It wasn't a cakewalk. However, black people were able to leave the plantations and find work in the cities, in these industrial towns. Well, as it happened, when blacks moved into some of these cities, white people began moving out. And I'm fast forwarding through history, but white people moved out and began creating what we know to be suburbs, right? They moved out of the urban areas into a suburban area, and they created a system whereby black people would be locked in to certain neighborhoods, would be locked into certain communities. Previously on the podcast, I talked about redlining. So here we're in these industrial towns, industrial cities, doing industrial work. White people move out. And as we know, when white people move out, often the resources leave with them. So as white people left these urban areas, they took the resource and the value of the property where they lived with them, right? And how many of us have heard about a black family or black families moving into suburban neighborhoods, and white people are being are concerned about property values decreasing because a certain group of people move in, right? But if a certain group of people move in, if the home is still the same, if the neighborhood is still the same, if the school is still the same, if the infrastructure is still the same, why would the value decrease? The value decreased because they had a devaluation of black people. And so white people moved out of these urban areas, and they took the values and and the investment with them. What do I mean? These cities that had factories that employed hundreds, thousands of people, that work began going overseas, right? You've heard made in America, and you've heard people talk about they want their products made in America. That's because there was a time when what we wore was made in America, right? The shoes that we wore, they were made in America. So the factories, all of that work was moved overseas where they can get the work much cheaper. So now you have these black people that left the plantations of the South. They came to the factories in the North, and then the factories closed up. The factories moved. The work moved. White people left. The value that they have for white people, that left with them. So that left black people without resources, without jobs. And there was a disinvestment in these urban areas because white people invest where they live, right? Black people, we were always in a position of disadvantage. We're then and now on this hamster wheel trying to catch up, right? But white people invest, they value what they have, and they increase value on what they have. So here black people are, there's no jobs, the taxes and the base, the economic base that supports communities is not there. And we had general disinvestment, not just the public sector, but also the private sector in these neighborhoods. So you see these communities start falling apart. The people aren't working. When people are poor, crime goes up. So we have crime. There's drug addiction. There's alcoholism, right? There's incarceration. There's violence. There's a lack of public safety. That's what we know, or what we think of, many of us, when we think of places like Compton, when we think of places like Camden, when we think of places like Philadelphia, right? When we think of places like Chicago. This poor area, high crime, and poor educational system. So when we think about gentrification with these same white people that left the communities, their children and grandchildren are moving back to these urban communities, and they're bringing their wealth with them. So the value of the property is going up, and the value is going up, and the people who live there, who are poor, who have limited resources, well, they can no longer afford to live there. So often these people become displaced. One example is something like this. And a middle class family come in, they buy property, and the property value goes up. A landlord who's renting a unit to a low-income family says, well, look, when your lease is up, the rent for this unit is going up $1,000, because now he can raise rent, because now that white people have moved back in, and affluent people and people with means, now this is an area where people want to be. And they decide where they want to be, where they want to move. So now this is a highly desired and sought after area. Well, now these landlords can afford to raise the rents. And so people who have lived in communities for 10, 15, 20 years no longer can afford to live there. So they're displaced and they have to go somewhere else, right? And then you'll see, they say, well, now here comes a Starbucks, right? The liquor stores kind of go away, or the bars go away. You have more coffee shops and cafes or bookstores, or there's more trendy, modern, contemporary living. Amenities, there's a Whole Foods comes in town, or a Wegmans comes in town. Those grocery stores where middle class or upper middle class, those people, where they shop. Because now the face of the community is changing, and the people who live there, those low-income people, well, they can't keep up with the cost of living in a place that they could afford. So now they have to go somewhere else. Now, the reason why I said I was excited to talk about this is because if we would have just pooled our resources, I mean, gentrification didn't have to be a problem for us, and it doesn't have to be a problem for us. If we would stop our habit of dependency, right? And now I'm going to go to what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad taught Black people from the 30s to his departure in the 70s. And that is, do something for yourself and stop this habit of being dependent. So we were dependent upon these companies, and we worked in their factories. We were dependent upon them. So when those jobs left, do we just not work again? Or do we get together and pool our resources and our talents and say, well, what do we need? We had such a habit as slaves to be guided and to be directed by our slave masters that when we became free, we didn't have the ambition to unite, to depend on each other, and to do something for self. So here we are just left up to the mercy, or we're vulnerable to the lack of mercy that people have for us. And, we grieve the loss of property. We grieve the loss of lifestyle. We grieve the loss of the tenor and the fabric of a neighborhood or a community because it's changing, because the people who live there are changing, because there's development that we can't afford to participate in. We can't engage with it because we can't afford to. But this did not have to happen. If we would have united, we don't need other people to teach our children. We don't have to depend so heavily on the public school system and be frustrated with what they are teaching or are not teaching if we just come together and teach our own children in our own schools. We wear clothes. Can't we produce factories to produce our clothes? We wear shoes. Can't we produce factories to produce our own shoes? Right? And the thought that I'm sharing with you is so foreign. It is so absurd. It is so unique. It is so novel. Because we think, well, how are we going to do that? Well, how did they do it? How did they do it? Don't we too have the ability to use our minds? Haven't we been educated? Haven't they given us an education? Haven't they trained us in their jobs? When they trained us to work in their factories and their factories went away, well, our skills didn't go away. Our abilities didn't go away. We could have used that to create something for ourselves. But instead, we sat in communities and watched them become blighted. We now live in urban areas and we watch the grass grow without trimming it, right? We watch our properties fall apart without repairing them. We watch our children drop trash on the ground without chastising them. We watch our children sell drugs without grabbing them and forcing them out of this lifestyle. We watch these liquor stores open up, right? So I'm thinking about zoning. Are we engaging with the local government? Or are we just allowing ourselves to be subject to those former slave masters and those who work in their positions? We have been a dependent people. We have been guided by other people. And when we are confronted with the reality of doing something for ourselves and making things happen, then we all of a sudden freeze up. But we are watching people create industry, create companies, create products. We're watching the public educational system educate our children in an incomplete and failing educational way so that they don't have the capacity to go beyond just getting a job and working for somebody else. They don't have the ambition or the know-how to bring their training and their education and create jobs for the rest of their people. We're only trained just enough to be job workers. So when we are confronted with the reality of gentrification, could it be that our negligence is coming full circle and now we are faced with what we didn't do? And I think when I'm looking at communities improve and I think it's, there's so much social injustice that does happen with gentrification. Absolutely. I do not disagree with that. But I also know that there's actions and steps that we can take. And I'm going to share some of those with you. But when I hear people who live in blighted communities, people who have trash outside their homes, because I've seen it, who have their own children selling drugs, using drugs, selling guns, complain about an investor bringing their money in to improve a community, to develop some land, to make sure that the area or the neighborhood is safe and is well lit. When I hear people complain about that, I think, well, what were you doing? And are you satisfied with what you have? And if you're not satisfied because there's no public safety, if you're not satisfied because your streets are not well lit, if you're not satisfied because the schools are not educating your children properly, if you're not satisfied because there are no jobs, if you are not satisfied because the buildings are run down, the homes are falling apart and dilapidated, if you are not satisfied, what is your dissatisfaction going to cause you to do besides complain? And if your dissatisfaction only causes you to have the activity of complaining, well, who's going to listen to somebody that's just complaining? You don't make yourself relevant. But if you and those who think like you are moved by your dissatisfaction into action and activity, into organizing and uniting our talents and our resources and doing something for self and purchasing some of these abandoned buildings and cleaning our streets and having the men do patrols so that our streets are safe, so that we can install solar lighting so that our homes and our neighborhoods are well lit. If we're not going to be compelled by our dissatisfaction to action, then we can hang it up. And we'll continue to watch others come in who have united their resources, who are relying on themselves to meet their needs instead of being dependent on others. Then we're going to continue to be at the mercy of those who may not always have mercy for us. And we haven't seen too many people have mercy for us. So I'm going to share something with you from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, something that is in the book, in a very powerful book called Message to the Black Man. The Negro leaders are frightened to death and are afraid to ask for anything other than a job. The good things of this earth could be theirs if they would only unite and acquire wealth as the masters and the other independent nations have. The Negroes could have all of this if they could get up and go to work for self. They are far too lazy as a nation. 100 years up from slavery and still looking to the master to care for them and give them a job, bread, and a house to live in on the master's land. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Surely the white race has been very good in the way of making jobs for the willing slaves. But this cannot go on forever. We are about at the end of it and must do something for self or else. The slave master has given you enough education to go and do for self, but this education is not being used for self. It is even offered back to the slave masters to help them keep you a dependent people looking to them for support. Let us unite every good that is in us for the uplifting of the American so-called Negroes to the equal of the world's independent nations. Ask for a start for self, and the American white people, I believe, are willing to help give us a start if they see you and I are willing to do for self. It will remove from them not only the worry of trying to get jobs and schools to a lazy people, but also will get them honor and sincere friendship all over the Asiatic world. In this section, there is further guidance on what we can do, and I'm going to share just a little bit of that guidance. Pool your resources, education, and qualifications for independence. Stop forcing yourselves into places where you are not wanted. Make your own neighborhood a decent place to live. Rid yourselves of the lust of wine and drink and learn to love self and your kind before loving others. Unite to create a future for yourself. Build your own homes, schools, hospitals, and factories. Stop buying expensive cars, fine clothes, and shoes before being able to live in a fine home. Build an economic system among yourselves. What you've just heard is recommendations and guidance from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad given to the Black community well over 50 years ago. And because we have ignored this guidance, then we are experiencing the calamities within the Black community in this nation that we are today. So now what will we do? You know, one thing that with the Black Lives Matter movement, we can be such shallow people and we can have such a hollow approach. Because if we on the surface want to say Black Lives Matter and let our children walk over trash on their way to school, do we believe that Black Lives Matter? If we're going to shout Black Lives Matter, but not create the conditions where our children can thrive and yet see us thrive as well and be inspired by what we've created with our own lives, do we really believe that Black Lives Matter? Do we believe that Black Lives Matter when we're going to sit and remain in a dependent position as a community and we're going to lambaste those who are coming in with a strong economic base and unity and develop a community for themselves? Isn't that what we should be doing? There's such a lesson that can be learned from white flight out of the Black community or out of urban areas that became Black communities after white flight. We sat around and we waited for white people to come back in, to give us jobs, to bring investment into our communities. Well, they're bringing investment in, but it may not be for us. So what are we going to do? Gentrification happens, and it's disheartening, and it's sad. But what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And if you paid attention to what I read, we have been well trained in this nation. We have been well educated in this nation. Will we take our training, our education, and our trillions of dollars and unite that for self? Well, we condemn ourselves to whatever happens if we do not. Brothers and sisters, I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Nora Speaks podcast. Until next time, stay in peace. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Nora Speaks podcast. Be on the lookout for a new episode coming at you fresh next week. And as always, if you want to learn more about me and the work that I do, visit my website, NoraMuhammad.com. Or if you have a listener question, email me at info@noraspeaks.com. You can also follow the Nora Speaks podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Nora Speaks Podcast. I'll be sure to include links in the show notes. If this show has value to you, please subscribe, rate, and review, and share it with family and friends. And be sure to check out previous episodes. And remember, don't just join the movement, be the movement. Stay in peace.